Welcome to From Data to Victory.
Welcome back to From Data to Victory with political strategist Fairalee Carrier, founder of Republican Political Consulting LLC, serving campaigns across Massachusetts and Texas. Fairalee helps candidates and voters understand how campaigns, policy, and decision making actually work. I'm Lisa Mosby, and today we're talking about what voters genuinely care about, what they tend to tune out, and why that disconnect matters more than most campaigns realize. Welcome, Fairleigh.
Hi, how are you?
Well, I'm well. Before we get into specifics, why do campaigns often misread what voters actually care about in the election?
I feel that sometimes candidates become self absorbed and they create campaigns are their own bubbles within themselves. So you've got a team of people, you've got a candidate, you've got a plan, everyone's motivated on, they're united on messaging for the campaign, that it can sometimes cause the candidate or people on the campaign to not recognize the real boots on the ground feedback that they're getting. So, campaigns are expensive. You invest a lot of time, money, and energy into how you're going to present yourself as a candidate. And it's hard to, once you commit to that as a candidate, it's hard to deviate. But that's why we here at Republican Political Consulting are so helpful, because we're objective and we can see outside of the campaign bubble so that you can better connect with your voters.
That makes total sense to keep people on track. What issues consistently move voters across the local, state, and federal races, regardless of what dominates headlines or social media?
Well, in the local races, I love local races, first of all, because you're more connected to the people. You can talk about a lot of the nitty gritty stuff that we all see in our neighborhoods, potholes, um, the police response, fire response, how our taxes are used in our counties and in our cities. So it's really easy to connect with voters in local elections because they are feeling the impact of political decisions every day. And it's the candidate's job to articulate how the voters are experiencing local policies, procedures, rules, and ballot initiatives. So local is great. But on the federal level, with congressional and U.S. senatorial races, you're speaking to a much wider audience. A congressional district, for example, in Texas, can cover many, many miles in several different neighborhoods. In Massachusetts, districts are very small in terms of geography, but you still sort of have that benefit of a local race in Massachusetts because the area is so small. Again, you're dealing with a smaller populace in a very condensed area in Massachusetts. So you still have to find a way to recognize the national headlines, but also communicate on a congressional or senatorial level that you're still from that town, that you still love that district, you still love that state, and that you adopt the values of that state or that county or congressional district. And sometimes that can be harder in bigger geographic maps, like in Texas, because you have a cross section of different voters that have very different beliefs and very different ideologies. But that's why, again, going from data to victory is where we take our data and we use it for the candidate's benefit. We study and analyze the maps through the data, through spending patterns, through how the press is impacting historical and prior elections. So that's it's you have to know your race and you have to know how to win it. And that is only done by knowing your voters.
Then, where do campaigns tend to overestimate the importance of things that feel loud or visible but don't actually change the votes?
I believe this happens a lot with social media. It's a phenomenon that occurs recently a lot with social media. Most voters are now engaged with social media more so than they were with regular television before social media. So it's hard to manage what narratives your voters are hearing and what they're adopting, but a campaign might be interested in a storyline that is important to the candidate or the campaign, but it's not important to their voters because, if, for example, if a candidate is in a local race is concerned about the potholes, but the people in that severe town are more concerned about police engagement. If they miss that mark in their campaign, their voters are going to tune out because they want a candidate who is going to at least what they care about. For example, if you feel there's over policing near school districts and you don't want your children to always see a huge police presence, but the candidate is talking about the potholes, you're going to have a disconnect with your voters.
So, how does emotional voting influence what voters say they care about versus what ultimately drives their decision in the voting booth?
That is such a great question because voting is a very emotional experience. Candidates tend to be smart, especially the candidates and clients that I work with. Smart as in intellectual, academic, or very astute due to their life experience. But voters are regular people. Most people would not put themselves out there to run for a public office, but they are watching the news, they are experiencing their lives, they're experiencing their families, they're going to work, they're driving, they're engaging with authorities within that jurisdiction, and they have feelings about it. And they don't like to talk about how most people don't like to talk about how they really feel because most people are afraid of what other people are going to think about their opinions. Candidates in politics, we love to talk, we love to share our opinions, and sometimes it's hard to recognize that most people aren't this way, and that you have to, as a candidate, recognize that most people feel very strongly about a lot of things, and they're never going to tell you truthfully how they really feel. They'll say, hey, I like you and I support you. But then as soon as they may hear something that changes how they feel about you, they won't tell you that you no longer have their vote. So it's hard to gauge. We don't have crystal balls. So it's so important to have boots on the ground, talking to people face to face, because it's really easy to be inauthentic digitally or on television. But if you are the candidate or you're working for your campaign and you are standing at that person's front door in their home and they allow you to come in and talk to them about the campaign, you're going to get a lot more honest feedback. And again, this is where those boots on the ground experiences have to be properly documented so that it can turn into useful data for the campaign.
So, along that same line, is there a difference between issues voters find passionate or their issues they're passionate about and the issues that actually motivate their turnout at the voting booth?
Absolutely. I think everyone knows that in 2020 with George Floyd, that was a global movement and it was a very emotionally charged situation. As a Black woman growing up in the South, there were definitely racial issues that impacted all campaigns across Texas. And the way that happened was people picked a side. Like, you know, there's this huge disconnect between the progress that we've made since the 1960s as Black Americans through 2025. But people in my generation, X, we grew up before, during, and after the internet. And we remember the days of old and we appreciate our parents and grandparents, all the blood, sweat, sacrifice we can have the opportunity to be who we are today. But we also recognize that progress was made. So racial issues, perhaps in my generation, would not be that emotional trigger, but it's still very much in our DNA. So this is where timing comes in. If an incident occurs closer to election day or closer to when early voting starts, it's definitely going to have an emotional trigger and maybe send even people like me, it might send me all the way back to my childhood when I remember hearing stories about the civil rights movement and my own family members participating in activism. So I might fall victim to forgetting all of the realities of the current day and vote emotionally. So Emotional triggers are all about timing. Sometimes bad things can happen, and depending on where you're at in the election cycle, there's an emotional trigger when it occurs, but you still have plenty of time in the campaign to kind of recenter your voters and get them back on track to what's really important and how you as a candidate can serve them.
So let's go back. In your experience, what happens when campaigns build their entire message around what they think voters should care about instead of what they actually do?
The short answer is that they lose campaigns. That's the short answer. You lose. Political candidates and elected politicians are not Steve Jobs, okay? They're not generally that smart enough to know what their voters need. Like Steve Jobs, he created, he bounced back Apple. He made us all realize that we need this little tiny computer in our hands called a phone, and that we all really like to hear music in our ears through the iPod. But politics is not the same as capitalism. Yes, you are selling yourself as a candidate, but ignore the realities of your constituents. So if you are not connecting with the issues that truly matter to the voters, you're going to lose, plain and simple. But the trick is, how do you find out what that is? That's where the data is so important.
That makes sense. And then what mindset shift helps campaigns and candidates better listen to voters instead of projecting onto them?
The mindset shift that's required is a constant state of being open-minded. Because again, this goes back to having your narrative, having your messaging, having all that planned out and game theoried and simulated. And then you actually are out and about with your constituents and you realize your messaging, your slogans, the issues that are important to you as a candidate aren't landing with the people that can actually vote for you. So you have to be open-minded. And sometimes you don't know if your strategy is going to work until you actually start campaigning. So you have to be open to changing directions. Again, I go back to the potholes versus the police presence example. If you're pro law enforcement and you believe that your voters need to also be pro law enforcement, what happens when you're constantly on the ground and everyone's concerned about the potholes? But you don't think potholes are an issue. You don't think that you believe as a candidate, right, that the jurisdiction is properly managing the taxpayer funds to address the potholes. That's your belief as a candidate. But your voters are saying, no, I'm paying taxes for these roads. I've lost tires. There's potholes by my kid's school and it's dangerous. I can't call the police for that. I need someone to represent my concern about these potholes on the road. So you have to be open-minded to what your voters are telling you. And if something's not landing and they're not telling you why, you have to be able to have the courage to ask. For example, I see that perhaps maybe not engage or you don't really care about the police. You have no issues with the police because every time, we talk about the police, it seems like you and your neighborhood and your caucus, y'all just tune us out. So what are we doing wrong? It's okay as a campaign to ask your voters what's important to you instead of you telling them what you think should be important to them.
Timing, emotions, mindset, all of those are so important. That wraps up today's episode of From Data to Victory with Fairalee Carrier. Campaigns and elections are often more complex than they appear on the surface, and understanding voter behavior is only part of the equation. To learn more about Fairalee's work with candidates in Massachusetts and Texas, visit fairalee.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and share this message with somebody who may need it today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.